Everyone. I suspect we'll have a few others join us. Um, Welcome to this webinar, which is one in a series of webinars sponsored by the Farm Family Resource Initiative. So on behalf of the SIU School of Medicine Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development and the Farm Family Resource Initiative, I want to thank you. I want to thank you both for your interest in these topics and for the work you do and the relationships you have with our Illinois producers and their family members. These aren't easy times, and those of you who are in our producers' lives are critical. Many of you are on the front lines, you're in the trenches, and you've got the scars and the stories to prove it. So again, thank you so much for being here today. This webinar focuses primarily on compassionate communication. In counseling, we use the phrase helping skills as a reference to these compassionate communication actions, which are both verbal and nonverbal. And they're things that we do to build rapport or promote insight, ease tension, uncover emotion, demonstrate empathy, build trust, and so on and so forth. I hope our conversation today is useful for you, both in your work and maybe even in your life beyond work. A quick note before we dig in: to smooth out any potential technology glitches, go ahead and make sure your microphones are muted. We found that's helpful with these live webinars. Also, if you have comments, go ahead and drop those in the chat box instead of either jumping in or selecting the raise your hand feature in the toolbar. I'll have a little more instruction for this in a second. And then lastly, our runtime for this webinar will be between 30 and 45 minutes. The exact time is going to depend on the questions and the discussion we have. Okay, so I have a few goals in mind for our time together today. First, I really want us to pull back the curtain. Often there's a lot of mystery around counseling and the tools that counselors use to help people. Today, I'd like to demystify that mystery and familiarize you with a number of simple but effective helping compassionate communication skills. Those helping skills that we're going to cover today really aren't rocket science. In fact, you might see them and at first think, really? This is what we're learning today? But I promise you that these simple interventions can have a long-lasting and powerful effect. I'd also like to take a moment to familiarize you with the population that you're likely to interact with. And that's traditional, rugged, self-reliant, middle-aged or older men. In fact, you might already be thinking right now, okay, this kumbaya, touchy-feely, counseling, compassionate talk, that's not going to go over so great with the people in my life. And you're not entirely wrong, but I'd like you to stay tuned because I have a few thoughts about how we can get around that. Second, I'd like to emphasize application in our conversation today. Theory is good, but how do we help real people in real situations in the real world? Today, we're going to talk about actual tools and actual skills you can begin using today if you want. And as a preview of coming attractions, I want you to know that the skills we're discussing today are pretty universal. They should work whether you're talking to a producer's spouse, your kids, anyone else, really. You won't be a therapist when you finish these sessions, but you will have more resources to draw on. You'll have more tools in your toolbox. Finally, I'd like our time today to be as conversational as we can make it. I absolutely welcome a dialogue. There are moments for discussion built into this webinar, but please, if you have questions or a thought to contribute, don't hesitate to jump in. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have something to contribute, just type that in the chat box, and I'll try to get to those comments after each slide. I want our time together to be what you want and what you need it to be. And as a last note, we are recording this webinar, so if that influences the types of comments or questions you might ask, just be aware of that. Okay, so before we really dive in, many of you might be thinking, okay, so who is this guy? And I think that's a really great question. My name is Dr. Nick Wyszynski, and I'm a program director in SIU School of Medicine Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development. I'm also the Year 1 curriculum director for the medical school. I hold a national board certification in counseling, and I've worked as an outpatient counselor, a crisis counselor, a group counselor, and so on and so forth. My clients have ranged in age from 3 years old to 73 years old. They've been grandmas and college students, ex-convicts, parents, survivors of abuse, and more. In graduate school, I did a lot of my research in the area of what's called men's studies, which is still somewhat unfamiliar, even in a lot of academic circles. Basically, what that means is I learned a lot about how society shapes men, and how and why men develop the attitudes and behaviors they do, and then how we might be able to work with men towards more productive ends. Okay, so let's dig in. I want to begin with a really basic idea. And that basic idea is this: when you're helping someone, when you're compassionately communicating with someone, you are the instrument. So let me say that again. When you're helping someone or compassionately communicating with someone, you are the instrument. As listeners, you are the greatest in the moment tool to provide help. So you can think about it this way. Physicians evaluate someone and then they go to their scalpel and use that as their tool. Soldiers in the military might plan something and then they use their rifle. Helpers listen and then they use themselves. So what does this mean? Well, to some extent, I think it means you can and should trust your gut. If something feels off, then probe, clarify, provide comfort, refer them to someone else. You are the instrument. Even if that means all you do is notice that something might be off and you run to get more help. You are the instrument. Second, practicing communication skills, these compassionate communication skills, is really important. Some of them don't necessarily feel natural. In fact, when you start using them, they can feel kind of awkward and uncomfortable. I like to use the analogy they can feel like trying on clothes that are either too loose or too tight. So practice is going to help you find the sweet spot with this. The next logical question is, well, then how do I practice these skills? I think the answer is you just jump right in. These skills are transferable, and like I said earlier, they're pretty nearly universal. They're good whether you're speaking with a producer's family member, or your neighbor. In fact, you might even talk about these skills with your friends and family members and tell them you might start using them. I think you'll find good listening and good helping skills, these compassionate communication skills, might just enrich your everyday relationships. Third, and this is a biggie, a big biggie, many of the producers and farm family members you know might feel a lot of pride, which makes them asking for or receiving help difficult. It might feel like weakness, or it might feel like a threat. And the pride factor might even influence the way that you use some of the compassionate communication skills that we're going to learn today. But I'm going to argue for just a moment that there's more than just pride at work here. So though the number of women farming is increasing, according to a 2017 ag census conducted by the USDA, as many as 84% of Illinois' primary producers, which is defined as the person who made the most decisions for the farm or who worked off the farm the least, 84% of those were men. Their average age is about 60. They're typically white. And this is painting in pretty broad brushstrokes, but these are often very traditional men with very traditional ideas about what it means to be a man. Typically that means, and I'm using this quote here from a Psychology Today article, typically that means being tough, staying in control, never crying, working through physical pain, and never backing down from a fight. And those aren't meant to be disparaging remarks, not at all, rather they're observations. And I don't know about you, but I see glimpses of my dad in those remarks. I see my uncles. More times than not, I see myself in those remarks. Psychologists have measured the ways these traits manifest themselves in men's lives. They found empirically that men, influenced by the culture we live in, feel compelled to pursue or emphasize success, power, and competition, often to the detriment of their own well-being. Men who need help or men who fail at something like work, for example, if there's some kind of farming catastrophe, might not just see this as a one-time context-specific failure. They might see it as a failure of being, quote unquote, a real man, which is a threat to their identity or a threat to what they want their identity to be. We also know that historically, our culture encourages men not to express emotion. Quote unquote, real men aren't supposed to be vulnerable or tender. They, as the saying goes, rub some dirt in it and move on. As a result, many traditional men have a really hard time asking for help or expressing the degree to which they're stressed out about something. I know for many of us, this is not a shock. But think about this. Think about the unique pressure this puts on your traditional older farming man. They're told they must be successful, that they cannot fail, that their family's survival depends on that maybe even their very manhood is at stake. And they're told that if they do fail, they can't talk about it, that they've got to grit and bear it and restrict all of their emotions. That's a pretty dang no-win situation. That's a way to feel trapped and hopeless really quick. And that kind of hopelessness can prompt some pretty drastic behaviors. Now, I want to pivot for a moment. I want to start talking through a few very concrete, really practical, compassionate communication skills that you can use in your conversations with producers and producers' family members. But I want you to keep this masculinity stuff in your mind, because after covering some basic helping skills, I'm going to give you some specific strategies for using those skills with these traditional, older, rugged men. Okay, like I mentioned before, helping skills are tools. And I'm using the phrase helping skills and compassionate communication skills interchangeably here. So these are tools. They're verbal, sometimes they're nonverbal, and we use these tools to do a lot of things. We use these tools to build rapport, to promote insight, to ease tension, to uncover emotion, to demonstrate empathy, to build trust, and so on and so forth. Like actual tools, helping skills can be mixed and matched depending on the work you're trying to accomplish. They aren't magical. In fact, many of them are going to feel pretty ordinary to you. You might even scoff at some of them when you see them, but I promise you, used appropriately, they can be really, really powerful. I want to begin with 4 of the most basic compassionate communication or basic helping skills. The first skill is called a minimal encourager. Minimal encouragers are probably going to make you look and sound and feel like a stereotypical TV show therapist. Well, maybe not every TV show therapist. This is probably more Fraser Crane than Dr. Phil. So what are minimal encouragers? Minimal encouragers are verbal or nonverbal statements or gestures that encourage the person you're speaking with to continue talking. They invite more disclosure. They prompt people to go deeper. A helping conversation is kind of like spinning a merry-go-round. Once it's going, it only needs a little push every now and then to keep the spin going. And that's the essence of a minimal encourager. They're just small little pushes that keep conversation flowing. So what are examples of minimal encouragers? Well, it could be something as simple as a head nod as someone's talking, or a uh-huh, yeah, or maybe even something more declarative, like, tell me more about that. These are short. They let the person you're speaking with know that you're engaged and listening, and often that results in more talking. The next skill is silence, and this might not sound like much of a skill, but it's actually pretty hard to implement. It's also really potent. One of my former professors used to say, silence is where the work actually happens. So how and why do we use silence? Well, silence gives your speakers adequate time to talk. We don't want to talk over them or assume we know what they're going to say. When they finish a statement and it feels like they have more to say, or maybe it doesn't feel like they have more to say, pause. This gives them time to elaborate or continue in another direction. Silence also affords you the opportunity to set or reset the tone and pace of the conversation. Sometimes when you're talking to someone, they're really frantic or anxious, and that results in a rapid pace of conversation. So silence allows you not to match their anxiety. Instead, it slows you down and it slows them down. Using silence appropriately is really important. In doing so, your calm will spread and you will help reset the pace of the conversation. A normalizing statement is one that communicates that a speaker is not alone in a given struggle or experience. It helps take away some of the stigma. Potentially, it can even make a problem seem more manageable. People might think, if others have made it through this or something similar, then so can I. And really, in my experience in counseling roles, that's one of the most basic questions all people ask at some point in their life. They ask, can I just make it to the end of this thing? Can I just make it through? Is it ever gonna be over? And normalizing statements can produce a kind of hope. It can let them know they aren't alone and that people can and do overcome. So an example of a normalizing statement might be, many farm families have been affected by this pandemic. You're not alone. Or, what you're saying to me right now does not sound weird at all. Or, you're right. This does seem like a really hard time. I know others who've overcome this, and I think together we can overcome this too. Normalizing statements shouldn't diminish someone's problem. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here in a second. Instead, it should open up opportunities for them to see hope and light at the end of the tunnel. The last of the most basic helping skills are open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those that can't be answered with one or two words. They prompt greater disclosure, which then gives you more information about the speaker and their needs. It also helps the speaker make sense of their own experience by allowing them to put language to it. Talking and naming, prompting speakers to turn their inner world out, can be a very powerful experience. Freud called therapy the talking cure. And maybe even you've experienced this. Sometimes it's just really nice to vent, and it's nice to have someone who can ask the right questions and get at the right things inside you. So open-ended questions sound like this. Well, what resources have you used thus far? Or what kinds of help are you looking for now? Or how was your experience trying this solution in the past? Or how would you describe the problems you're experiencing right now? Now, one thing I want you to notice about all of those example questions I just asked, I never begin with the word why. Why questions are typically not the best open-ended questions to ask because they feel accusatory and can make people feel defensive. So instead of, well, why haven't you tried this solution? That can sound make people defensive. So instead, you might want to retool that language and use like a what or a how. Okay, so we're now transitioning to some higher order helping skills. And I say these are higher order because they aren't necessarily as intuitive as all those things we just talked about. And frankly, because these can feel kind of uncomfortable at times. Nevertheless, these skills are powerful. And when used appropriately, they really can go a long way to build rapport. The first of these higher order helping skills is called immediacy. Immediacy is using your gut to question or draw attention to something in the here and now. I'm going to say that again. Immediacy is using your gut to question or draw attention to something in the here and now. It's listening not just to what is being said, but it's also listening to how things are being said. So an example of this might be, I noticed when I said fill in the blank that you seemed really hesitant. Tell me a bit more about that. Or it could be, as you talk, I get the sense that you're really worried about X, Y, and Z. Say more about that. What makes this skill feel weird at times is that it feels like bad manners. Somehow, most of us are taught to ignore the weird things we feel in the here and now when we're talking to someone and to move on like they didn't happen. Immediacy is the opposite of that. And that's what makes it a risk. Sometimes you might feel something, comment on it, and be wrong. And that's why I always preface my immediacy statements with, I could be wrong about this, and please tell me if I am, but I just get the sense that, and then you fill in the blank. Empower those that you're speaking with to correct you if your feeling is off. If you swing the bat, you might hit something. If you don't swing, you'll never hit a thing. So take a swing, see what happens. The next skill, reflecting feeling, can also be kind of challenging. The goal of reflecting feeling seems similar to immediacy, but there's subtle differences in its purposes, which aren't really all that necessary to get into here. What's most important is to know this. It's to reflect feeling is to act like a mirror. To reflect feeling is to act like a mirror. It's acknowledging the underlying feelings behind the content of what a speaker might be saying. So let me say that again, because that's a big idea. It's acknowledging the underlying feelings behind the content of what a speaker might be saying. Sometimes when we're talking, we're not really aware of what we feel. We're just talking. If someone on the outside watching us sees or senses a feeling behind what we're saying and acknowledges it, it can produce greater awareness and actually strengthen the trust between two people. It can help the speaker feel understood, even when they don't quite understand themselves. An example of this might be, when you said you had to depopulate your farm, I imagine that has to feel really sad. Or when you were talking about your financial struggles, I can sense your anger. Reflecting feeling is kind of like listening with your third ear. If you don't feel comfortable reflecting feelings back to someone, maybe you don't say them out loud. Maybe all you do is you simply recognize those feelings within yourself and use that to build more empathy for the person you're speaking with. I think as a note here, it's important to know that for some people, especially men, all feelings get expressed as either anger or irritation. If you have a particularly gruff person in front of you, especially a really gruff man, there might be an underlying emotion aside from anger that they just don't know how to communicate, or they're not really willing to communicate at the moment. It doesn't mean they're mad at you. It just means there's something stirring up inside of them right now. And for whatever reason, all they can do is express it as frustration. The next two skills are tough because used incorrectly, they can make you sound kind of like a jerk. But let me put a caveat in here. Don't let that deter you from exercising these skills. And you're going to know exactly what I mean when I explain them, and it'll be pretty obvious how to use them effectively. First, if you can, I think it's totally cool to experiment with appropriate self-disclosure. That means using your own personal experiences to relate back to the person you're speaking with, which builds rapport. I do think, however, that this is something you might want to use sparingly, and this is where it can go off the rails. The helping conversation you're having is not about you. Let me say that again. The helping conversation you're having with others is not about you. If you can't take your experience in self-disclosure and then pivot back to the speaker, then I wouldn't do it. So an example of this might be, yeah, you know, my family went through something really similar. It can be very hard to cope with. Tell me how you're coping with it. See, what that was is self-disclosure and then using that to pivot back to the person. This isn't universally true, but I'd recommend not self-disclosing if you still have a lot of emotional energy tied up in whatever experience it is that you're discussing. So for example, if you're in the midst of a really messy divorce and this person you're speaking with is also in the midst of a messy divorce, it might not be a safe thing to disclose that for both you and for the person. It might still be too emotionally charged for you, and it might be worth just holding that back. The last skill is called positive reframing. The idea here is that you're looking for strength in the midst of despair. I'm going to say that again because it's a big idea. The idea here is that you're looking for strength in the midst of despair. This is not, however, looking at the bright side of things or telling the person you're speaking with, well, this might suck, but look at all the good things you have. People don't need to hear that. When people need help, they don't want to be told to count their blessings, even if they might have a lot of other blessings. Pain and need are blind to that. We as people on the front lines don't want to minimize anyone's pain. So how can you do this in a way that affirms the strength in the person you're speaking with, but doesn't diminish their pain? Often, I think it means commenting on their strength and their ability to endure. So an example of positive reframing might be, wow, it sounds really hard what you're going through right now, but I so admire your strength to reach out. Or you might be struggling, but the courage it takes to contact us to tell me that contact us tells me that you're an overcomer at heart. Again, that's looking for strength in the midst of despair. It doesn't minimize the fact that they're going through it right now, but it does look at that strength and those little nuggets of courage inside that help propel them forward. So I want to return to what we started with, and that's a look at traditional, rugged, self-reliant men. As we said before, often men are really resistant to help seeking, and they're resistant to emotionality. So I want to ask a question some of you might be thinking right now. And the question is this: well, if that's true, if men are resistant to help seeking and emotionality, then how aren't all of these things we just talked about a giant waste of time? I think that's really valid, and I have a few answers for you. The first is, and this is just kind of an appeal based on faith, these skills work. I've used them for years now with all types of people, many of them very traditional men, and they work. So take a risk and see what comes of it. The second answer I have is there's a way to adapt our helping approach, our compassionate communication approach when working with men. And much of this is based on the idea of positive reframing, which we just discussed. So again, looking for the strength in the midst of the mess. Men who don't ask for help and who don't demonstrate emotion are unhealthier than those who do. We know that. The scholarship is clear. But there are qualities traditional men possess that can be leveraged into strengths. They are strengths. And there are ways to approach men that don't feel like it's much of a threat. So traditional men might be more willing to receive help if you approach them as a partner or an ally rather than their savior. In fact, that's probably just good practice with everyone. I was reviewing some of the men's studies research in anticipation of this webinar, and one group of writers acknowledges that men are typically comfortable and socialized to work as part of teams. They're cool with being in sports, fraternities, military, the Elks. Frame the help giving that you're providing as being part of their team. You want to be on team whoever. You're not there to take their power away. You're not there to save them. It's not because they're deficient and or lacking in some way. You're there to be an assist to them. And that can help make receiving help and this compassionate communication a little bit safer. Some men are especially affected by or drawn to the idea of heroism. They grew up wanting to be superheroes or army men or the good guys who save the day. And needing help may make them feel like they failed in that regard. So you might want to communicate through your actions and even your words how reaching out for help makes them the hero of their family. They had the courage to take the risk to reach out to someone, even if it's a stranger, and in doing so, they're saving the day. And if it's ethical and you know of other men who are respected in your communities who've also reached out for help, get permission to connect those guys. Seeing other men who are successful and heroic for asking for help will help normalize help seeking as one of those heroic acts. It's something they do to save their family even, perhaps. There aren't many positive or structured rites of passage in our society today, but that doesn't mean that we can't create any. If you're working with a farming man with children, you might frame help seeking as a way to pass along their expertise and their traditions to their kids. So help seeking can become a way for him to teach and train, to pass the torch, to leave his mark, to protect his family's destiny. It might be a way for him to communicate that getting help is part of what it means to be a producer. Getting help then becomes an opportunity to share wisdom that they've accumulated and that they're continuing to accumulate. So before we transition to questions and discussion, I'd like to make a brief announcement. When we're done today, you're going to receive an email from me with a link to an evaluation form. We would love your feedback about today's webinar. and anything that we might be able to do for you in the future. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions that we might have at this time. You're more than welcome to drop those in the chat, and I'll watch that for about a minute or so and respond accordingly. And then once discussion kind of wraps up, or the questions wrap up, or if we don't get any questions, then I'll move on to the next little bit. So if you have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat box. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through. So if you do have a question or comment, feel free to leave that in here, and I'll get to those between slides as I transition to the next few items. So I always like to begin a webinar by talking about what we're going to talk about, then talk about it, then kind of review some of the things we talk about. So these are just short little questions to call back some of the information we've discussed. So which helping skill involves naming or recognizing the feelings underlying someone's remarks? Just think back on that. What did we talk about? What was that skill? The skill is reflection of feeling. It's acting as a mirror, holding that up to another person, listening with your third ear to what might be feeling underneath a statement. I've got a comment in the question box here. It says, if you're talking with a farmer and you think they need help, how would you subtly suggest they reach out to someone? Yeah, I think it depends on a couple of things. First, if you have a good relationship with this person already, then I think you can be pretty direct in how you approach that. I think you still need to be mindful of many of the things we talked about, but if you have a really good relationship with this person already, I think you might want to just be as direct as you can be. If you get the sense that a producer or anybody for that matter needs help because they're considering harm to themselves or others, and it's a potentially risky, lethal situation, then don't dance around that. You need to get help immediately. Call your local crisis hotline, which I'm going to show you some numbers here in just a second. Call law enforcement for a well check if you're not near them. Those kinds of things. If this is someone that you don't necessarily have a relationship with, and it's someone that isn't in any kind of immediate danger, I think the best approach is, and this might sound like a cop-out, but to use these skills that we've been talking about. As you have conversation, reflect feeling back, positive reframe by talking about their ability to endure. Use your minimal encouragers to keep drawing out information. And I think through that conversation and by compassionately communicating with them, you're going to get to a point where you've earned the right to say things like, hey, I really think you might be able to benefit from some people coming alongside you and being a part of your team. Again, not that we're trying to rescue anyone or not that we're trying to take anyone's power away, but you might really benefit from someone giving you some assistance. And you being in the driver's seat, but us helping all that we can. I hope that's an answer to that question. Another assessment question is, which helping skill involves naming or recognizing the feelings underneath someone's remarks? Think back to that. It's like holding up a mirror to someone. Oh, we've already done that one. Pardon me. What helping skill involves using the use of short words or phrases like uh-huh or yeah, or tell me more, in hopes that it stimulates the speaker to say more. This is one of the very first things we talked about. In fact, it was the first thing we talked about. Those are minimal encouragers. Again, conversation is like a merry-go-round. A little push every once in a while helps the conversation spin. And then lastly, let's say a 45-year-old farmer friend of yours calls, and he has concerns about the viability of his farm due to economic hardship. He says, I've tried everything I know how to do and nothing seems to be working. How would you use the helping skill of positive reframing here? And just think about what you might say. I think my approach with this, depending on the kind of relationship I have, would be to say, wow, it takes so much courage to reach out. I'm so grateful for your call. Or wow, you have a lot of strength. You have endured a lot, and I really admire the strength you have, and the strength you're demonstrating by reaching out is exactly the strength it's going to take to move you towards whatever solution you need. So I want to provide some additional resources. A webinar is great, but a webinar doesn't last 24 hours a day. Some of the things here might have been really, really helpful, and then you might go on about your life and think, oh crap, I really need more. Well, here's something more that might be of use to you. This webinar is part of a series of webinars by the Farm Family Resource Initiative. The Farm Family Resource Initiative is really an effort by Illinois government to address needs that farmers and farm family members have. It doesn't have to be a mental health need specifically. It can be about access to resources or access to healthcare or access to information about housing or you name it. And the Farm Family Resource Initiative is staffed by a wonderful professional. Her name is Karen Stallman. Her information is located at this web address, siumed.edu/farm. And that website also has information about webinars, recordings from previous webinars are there, information about upcoming events are there, the mission of this. And one of the centerpieces of the Farm Family Resource Initiative is a hotline. And I would encourage you to make note of this number. That helpline number is 1-833-FARM-SOS. That's 1-833-FARM-SOS. It's staffed 24/7. When someone calls, they'll get through to a person, or they'll get a message saying they'll have somebody call them right back, and they can ask anything that they need to. Right now, this is being piloted in 6 counties in central Illinois. The hope is that it's going to expand out throughout the state. This is an electronic version of a resource card that has that information. It's also got National Suicide Prevention Hotline, etc. If you'd like flyers with this information or these little wallet cards, we have that, and I'm sure that's something that Karen Stallman can get to you or get to organizations that you represent. So again, the Farm Family Resource Initiative, it's an effort to really help our producers and their family members. Feel free to reach out and connect as much as you want. And with that, I want to open it back up to more questions and discussion. This is the end of the webinar, so if you have any last minute thoughts or questions or anything, feel free to drop them in. Yeah, Karen writes here, if anyone wants wallet cards, which is exactly the front and back of what I just showed you, then we can absolutely send those to you. Thanks for that, Karen. Anybody else? Questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, I'm not seeing anything else come through. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you today. I hope something in this was helpful for you as you work with producers and their family members. I hope, gosh, maybe it was even helpful for you and thinking about how you might interact with your friends and family members. Again, this is sponsored by the SIU School of Medicine Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development as a part of the Farm Family Resource Initiative. More webinars are going to be happening through this work, so please check back. We'd love to have you participate. Tell your friends about us, spread the word about the hotline in our pilot counties. And don't forget, I'll be sending you an evaluation shortly following this webinar. And with that, I want to thank you again. I hope you all have a great day and a great weekend. Take care, everyone.